The autumn rain tapped gently against the tall windows of the Chicago Historical Society, its rhythm slow and patient, like a heartbeat from another time. Dr. Margaret Chen adjusted the soft white cotton gloves on her hands, then carefully lifted the lid of the mahogany box that had arrived that morning. Inside lay a small note written in a shaky but sincere hand. Found these in my grandmother's attic after she passed. Thought you might find them interesting. Robert Whitman. Beneath layers of aged yellow tissue paper rested a stack of old photographs, fragments of lives long vanished. As the Society's lead photographic conservator, Margaret had handled thousands of such donations. Yet something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the note, or perhaps it was the weight of the box itself, as though memory had settled inside it. She lifted the first photograph. A family of 6 stood on the porch of a small wooden house. The soft sepia tones, the tidy posture, everything pointed to the early 1900s. On the back, faint pencil marks read 1912, the Morrison family, Springfield, Illinois. The image captured an oddly tender moment. The father, a man in his 40s with a neatly waxed mustache, stood proudly behind his seated wife. Her hand rested gently on the shoulder of a young girl. 3 boys flanked them, the youngest barely 5. Their clothes were modest, but pressed shoes polished every detail, suggesting a family that valued dignity despite their means. What struck Margaret most was the warmth, a rare softness. Most portraits of that era were rigid faces frozen by long exposure times, but the Morrisons seemed relaxed, almost caught mid-laughter. The smallest boy tried to suppress a grin, and even the father's expression seemed touched by quiet joy. Margaret slid the photograph beneath her magnifier, a habit earned through years of patient restoration. She adjusted the focus, letting her eyes trace every grain, every imperfection. Then, something caught her attention. Behind the family's left side stood what appeared to be a neighboring house. Through one of its windows, barely visible, was a figure. At first, she assumed it was a trick of light, a reflection perhaps, or damage in the film. But as she increased magnification, the shape sharpened into something undeniably human. And that figure was holding an object long and dark aimed directly toward the Morrison family. Margaret froze. The object, now unmistakable under the lens, looked disturbingly like a rifle. She sat back, removing her glasses, heart thudding, then leaned in again. No mistake. The smiling family remained in the foreground, forever frozen in their moment of joy. And behind them, through a distant window, someone was watching, someone armed. For the next hour, she examined the photograph under every possible light, every angle. Training taught her caution shadows deceive, and the human eye invents what it fears. But the shape did not disappear. If anything, it grew clearer. She photographed the print with her high-resolution camera, transferring the image to her computer. Modern software peeled back the grain, and age letting her see details no one in 1912 could have imagined. The father, Thomas Morrison, according to the note, looked to be in his early 40s, the kind of man who worked with his hands. His wife's dress was plain, but clean, practical for a woman raising 4 children. They stood arranged by height, the eldest, perhaps 15, the youngest, 5. And yet, something in their positioning felt deliberate. the mother's chair slightly off center. The children angled inward, leaving a small gap, a narrow, empty space beside them. Margaret zoomed closer. That space seemed almost intentional, as if someone else had once stood there and been removed. Or perhaps, she thought, as the rain whispered against the window, perhaps that missing presence was the one still watching from the house across the yard. She printed the enhanced image and laid it gently on her desk. The soft hum of the city below faded, leaving only the rain and the quiet pulse of time. The family smiled back at her from a century away, while in the background, behind glass, a single dark shape lingered, silent, patient, forever watching. And Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in that frozen moment of 1912, the story hadn't truly ended. Tell me, if you looked closely enough into that window, what do you think you would see? The family wasn't looking directly at the camera, a small, almost imperceptible deviation from the norms of the time. Instead, their gazes seemed to drift just slightly to the side, as if something or someone had drawn their attention away from the lens. Even the father's stance seemed uneasy, his left hand resting with quiet protectiveness on his eldest son's shoulder. Margaret felt a tension she couldn't quite name. Her computer chimed softly, pulling her back to the present. The digital enhancement had finished processing. She opened the file, leaned closer, and zoomed in on the window across the street. And then she froze. The enhanced image revealed details that hadn't been visible before, details that made her spine prickle. The figure was no longer a vague shape. It was a man dressed in dark clothing, medium-build posture, steady and deliberate. He wasn't merely standing there, he was aiming. The rifle, because there was no longer any doubt it was. A rifle was pointed directly at the Morrison family, gathered on their porch. Margaret felt her breath shorten. She reached for the phone and dialed her colleague. "James, I need a favor." Her voice was low, careful. "Can you look up a family, the Morrisons of Springfield, Illinois, around 1912? Anything unusual? Any record involving violence or threats?" On the other end, Dr. James Martinez, a historian who specialized in early crime records, hesitated. "That's oddly specific, Margaret." "What did you find? I'm not sure yet," she replied softly. "But I think this photograph may have captured something important. Maybe even a crime as it was about to happen." As she waited for James to call back, Margaret turned to the other photographs in the box. Many seemed to be from the same family, the Morrisons, through the years. Birthdays, picnics, holiday gatherings, the children growing older, taller, the parents aging gently alongside them. They looked like any American family of their time, hard-working, proud, bound by the quiet dignity of ordinary life. But the 1912 portrait felt different. The posture, the eyes, the faint tension that ran beneath their smiles. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that every face in that photograph was aware of something just beyond the frame, something they couldn't ignore. Her phone rang. "Margaret, James," said his voice tight. "You're not going to believe this. I found the Morrisons. Thomas Morrison, 43, his wife Ellen, 39, 4 children." He paused. "On September 15th, 1912, Thomas Morrison was shot and killed on his front porch. His family witnessed it. The killer was never caught. The case went cold within months." Margaret stared at the photograph, her pulse quickening. 4 children, James. This photograph shows 5 family members plus the parents. That would make 6. James's voice turned cautious. I checked the records twice. It's clear Thomas and Ellen Morrison had 4 children. William 16, Henry 13, Margaret 9, and little James 6. There was no 5th child. Margaret looked closer, counting again, lips moving silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the parents. 6 in total. You're right, she whispered. I must have miscounted before. 2 parents, 4 children. But her voice trembled slightly as she said it. She leaned back, staring at the image glowing on her monitor. If Thomas Morrison was killed on his porch in September 1912, and this photograph is dated the same year, then this might be the last photograph ever taken of them together. And you think James asked quietly that the photo might have captured the killer in the act. Margaret's eyes didn't leave the screen. The figure in the window was sharp now, solid, intent. The barrel of the rifle, dark and steady, aligned perfectly with Thomas Morrison's chest. I think, she said slowly, this photograph might be the only surviving evidence of that murder. An hour later, Dr. Martinez arrived at the Historical Society, rain clinging to his coat. He carried a thick folder of printed reports from the Illinois State Archives. Pages yellowed by time, but newly unearthed by the digital database. Margaret had already cleared her desk. The Morrison photographs, each one cleaned and flattened, were laid out in careful sequence, forming a timeline of lives cut short. I've gone through the Springfield police records, James said, taking a seat beside her. The Morrison case dominated headlines for weeks. Thomas was a machinist at the Springfield foundry. No enemies, no debts, no disputes. Nothing that hinted at a motive. Margaret handed him a magnifying glass. Look here, she murmured. The left side of the photo, about 2/3 up, the window. James adjusted the lens, leaning close. Minutes passed in silence. Then slowly he set the magnifier down. His face had gone pale. That's definitely a rifle, he said quietly. And whoever's holding it had a perfect line of sight to Thomas Morrison. He looked at Margaret. Have you shown this to anyone else? She shook her head. Not yet. I needed to be certain of what we were seeing. Margaret turned back to her computer where the enhanced image filled the screen. A century-old photograph now reborn in pixel clarity. And behind the smiling family, a shadow, frozen mid-aim. The rain outside softened to a whisper. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. The photography technology of 1912 was more sophisticated than most people imagine. Large format cameras used by traveling portrait artists could capture every crease of fabric and flicker of sunlight with haunting precision. And this particular image, the Morrison family on their porch, bore the signature of one such photographer. James spread the police reports across the desk, the paper whispering against the wood. According to witnesses, he began softly. Thomas Morrison was killed by a single rifle shot around 3:30 in the afternoon, September 15th, 1912. He just returned from work reading his newspaper on the porch. When the bullet came from across the street, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Did they see the shooter? James nodded, eyes still on the page. Ellen Morrison told police she saw someone in the window of the house opposite an empty one. By the time neighbors rushed over, whoever it was had vanished. The house belonged to the Hicks family, away visiting relatives in Chicago. Someone broke in and used it as a sniper's nest. A quiet dread settled between them. Margaret's pulse quickened. James, what if this photograph was taken on the day of the murder? What if we're looking at the exact moment Thomas Morrison was being targeted? James looked back at the records. The family had hired a traveling photographer, Samuel Hayes. He told police he'd taken several portraits that afternoon, but when they asked to see them, Hayes claimed they were destroyed in a darkroom accident. Margaret frowned. How convenient. What happened to him? He left Springfield the very next day. Never came back. Police tried to trace him, but those photographers they moved often used aliases. Hard men to find. James's gaze lifted slowly from the page. Margaret. What if Hayes wasn't just documenting the murder? What if he was part of it? Margaret leaned in, studying the image once more. The family's strange positioning, the subtle unease in their eyes. Look at how they're arranged, she murmured. It's not a natural pose. They're all slightly turned to the left. Leaving Thomas Morrison in perfect line of sight from the window, James finished quietly. Margaret exhaled, reaching for another photograph from the same donation. This one, showing 3 of the Morrison children playing in their backyard, dated just 2 months before the portrait. James, she said softly, we need to trace this donation carefully. Robert Whitman said he found these in his grandmother's attic. But what if his grandmother wasn't just a collector? James was already pulling out his phone. I'll cross-reference Robert Whitman with the Morrison case. If there's any family connection, it might explain how these photos survived when Hayes swore they were destroyed. While James made his calls, Margaret continued leafing through the photographs. Most were ordinary, sunlit moments of family life from the early 1900s. But several carried the same professional composition, the same uncanny stillness. The Morrison family wasn't the only one captured through Hayes's lens. There were others, other porches, other families, all framed with the same precision. When James returned, his face was pale. Margaret. Robert Whitman's grandmother was Sarah Hayes. She was married to Samuel Hayes, the photographer. Margaret froze. The pieces began to align. So Sarah kept the photographs all these years, even though her husband told police they were destroyed. The question is, why? Maybe she knew, James murmured. Maybe she knew her husband was involved in Morrison's murder and kept the evidence as insurance or guilt. Margaret looked down at the Morrison portrait again. Thomas's gentle smile, Ellen's hand resting lovingly on her daughter's shoulder. The children's faces bright, unaware, caught forever in that quiet moment before everything changed. James, she said softly, we need to contact Robert Whitman. If his grandmother kept these hidden for over a century, there's more to this story than we realize. The next morning, Robert Whitman arrived at the Chicago Historical Society. A tall man in his 60s with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, he carried a worn leather satchel, the kind that creaks softly when it opens. When Margaret had called the night before, his answer had been immediate. I've been waiting for this call my entire life. Dr. Chen, Dr. Martinez. He greeted them, shaking their hands with quiet conviction. I should have come forward years ago, but my grandmother made me promise not to, until after she passed. She died 6 months ago, he continued at 97. Margaret gestured toward the conference room. On the table lay the Morrison photographs, the police reports, and every historical document James had gathered. Mr. Whitman, Margaret said gently, we believe these photographs may be evidence from a murder in 1912. Your grandmother was married to Samuel Hayes, the photographer who took them. Robert nodded, setting down his satchel. She was, and she lived with what happened for the rest of her life. He drew out a small, time-worn journal, the leather darkened by age. This was my grandmother's diary from 1912. She wrote down everything. James leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything, Robert nodded. My grandfather Samuel wasn't just a photographer. He was involved in labor disputes. In 1912, factories all across Illinois were on edge, workers fighting for fair pay, management pushing back. Samuel was hired by business interests to document union organizers and sympathizers. Margaret felt a slow chill crawl down her spine. Thomas Morrison, she said quietly, was one of them. Wasn't he? Robert opened the diary to a page marked with a frayed ribbon. According to Sarah Hayes' own words, Thomas Morrison was among the leading organizers trying to establish a workers' union at the Springfield foundry. A man who'd unknowingly stepped into the crosshairs of forces far larger and far darker than he could ever have imagined. The foundry owners were determined to silence Thomas Morrison. To them, he wasn't a man, he was a disruption, a threat. And so, they hired Samuel Hayes to identify and eliminate that threat. Eliminate. James echoed softly the word hanging heavy in the quiet room. According to the diary, Samuel was hired to photograph labor organizers to create identification records for company security. But somewhere along the way, the task changed. The boundaries blurred. The camera became a weapon in its own right. Robert turned several brittle pages in his grandmother's journal. She wrote, he said quietly that Samuel began to realize what was really happening. That his photographs weren't being used to monitor workers, but to mark them, to make them targets. Margaret stared down at the Morrison family portrait, the image that had begun it all. So, your grandfather positioned the family to give the shooter a clear shot. Robert shook his head. No, it was the opposite. He was trying to save them. He leaned closer, pointing gently toward the faint grain of the image. Look here. Thomas Morrison isn't centered. Samuel deliberately placed him slightly behind the porch railing, partially shielded by his wife and children. If the shooter had fired, then the angle would have been wrong. The bullet wouldn't have reached him. James's voice was low. But Morrison was killed. Robert's expression softened, heavy with sadness, because Samuel failed. The men who hired him grew suspicious. They discovered he had warned Morrison about the plan. 3 days later, they forced him at gunpoint to arrange another meeting with the family. This time, they gave him orders. Thomas Morrison was to stand exactly where they wanted him. And if Samuel refused, Robert's voice faltered for a moment. They said they'd kill Ellen and the children too. A long silence filled the room, the kind that hums beneath the surface, full of things no one wants to say aloud. So, he made an impossible choice, Margaret whispered. between betraying his friend or letting an entire family die. Robert nodded. He chose to save the others. He did what they demanded. He positioned the family just as they ordered, but in a way that would ensure only Thomas was exposed. It's why there was only one shot. James slowly lifted the police report again, his voice quiet with realization. That explains everything. Ellen and the children were able to describe the shooter because Samuel had prepared them. He knew what was coming, and he wanted them to survive. And remember, Robert ran a hand across the diary's worn cover. He lied to police, said the photographs were destroyed in a darkroom accident. But he couldn't bring himself to burn them. They were his guilt and his confession. Margaret looked again at the Morrison photograph, at the light across their faces, at the frozen calm that suddenly felt unbearably fragile. What she'd first seen as evidence of murder in progress now revealed something else entirely, a desperate attempt at mercy. Those alert expressions weren't fear, they were awareness. They were witnesses being quietly prepared to outlive what was coming. "Mr. Whitman," she asked softly, "why did your grandmother keep this secret for so long?" Robert closed the diary. "Because Samuel made her promise. The truth could only come out when it could no longer hurt the living." He looked up at them, his voice steady but distant. The men who ordered the murder were powerful owners, investors, men whose names built half the state. Samuel feared that if anyone spoke, it would destroy the surviving Morrisons. "And us? And now?" James asked. "Now they're all gone," Robert replied. Ellen Morrison passed in 1967. The children lived full lives. My grandmother, she waited until the last of them was gone before releasing the truth. She wanted Thomas Morrison to be remembered not just as a victim, but as a man who died fighting for the dignity of workers. And she wanted the world to know that even in the darkest moments, there were still those who tried to do right. The room felt still after he spoke, only the hum of the building's old radiators breaking the silence. That weekend, Dr. Martinez buried himself in archives, tracing patterns across forgotten police records and factory ledgers. Margaret, meanwhile, spent hours scanning and digitally preserving every photograph Robert had donated, ensuring that not a single image would fade again into obscurity. By Monday morning, they had uncovered something far greater than a single murder. Margaret James said. Spreading a map across the conference table, the surface pricked with red pins. This wasn't an isolated case. The Morrison killing was one of many. He pointed to each pin in turn. Springfield, Peoria, Joliet, Rockford, Aurora. I found at least 6 other incidents between 1910 and 1914 labor organizers shot by unseen snipers. Always from abandoned or empty buildings. Always with witnesses who saw a figure in a window. Never identified, never caught. Margaret looked up from her screen. And how many of those had photographers present beforehand? James checked his notes. At least 3 that we can confirm. Possibly more. Each time the photographer left town immediately afterward, never seen again. When Robert returned later that day, he brought with him a small wooden box, worn and polished smooth with age. Inside were letters folded carefully. The ink faded to brown. They were correspondence between Samuel and Sarah Hayes. Letters written from dusty Illinois towns where labor wars were quietly spilling blood. Margaret lifted one of the envelopes, delicately tracing the uneven handwriting across its surface. Even after all these years, she could almost feel the weight of what the words must contain. Guilt, fear, and perhaps the smallest flicker of redemption. These letters, they paint a picture of my grandfather's growing horror at what he had become involved in. Robert murmured, handing Margaret a brittle yellowed envelope. He thought he was just taking photographs for business records. He didn't realize he was documenting systematic murder. Margaret unfolded the fragile paper with care. Samuel Hayes' handwriting was precise, but trembled with urgency as the dates approached the Morrison incident. "My dearest Sarah," she read softly. "I fear I have become entangled in something far more sinister than I first understood. The men who hire me speak of eliminating problems, of permanent solutions. I believe they mean to kill the workers I have been photographing. I do not know how to free myself without bringing harm to us both." James lifted another letter dated just days before Thomas Morrison's death. "Listen to this," he said quietly. "They have made it clear that if I do not cooperate, I will be considered a liability to be eliminated along with the workers. But I cannot live with myself if I continue. I must find a way to warn Morrison without exposing my role." The room fell silent. Margaret felt the pieces of the puzzle locked together with a dreadful clarity. "So, Samuel Hayes began altering the photographs," she whispered. "He positioned the families in ways that might sabotage the assassinations. The Morrison photograph. Thomas behind the railing, half hidden, that wasn't an accident. But it didn't work," Robert said sadly. "According to my grandmother's diary, his employers grew suspicious after several failed attempts. They began monitoring his sessions and finally forced him to cooperate under threat of death." James had been cross-referencing dates between the letters and police files. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I think I know why this conspiracy was never exposed. Look at the timeline. These murders happened over 4 years across multiple jurisdictions. Local police in 1912 didn't communicate. Each case was investigated separately. No one ever saw the pattern." Margaret examined another photograph, a family in Peoria, Illinois. Under magnification, a faint figure appeared in a distant window, holding what seemed unmistakably like a rifle. "James," she breathed, "we're looking at evidence of multiple planned assassinations. Samuel Hayes wasn't documenting one murder, he was recording an entire campaign of violence against labor organizers." Robert opened his grandmother's diary to the final pages. Sarah wrote that Samuel estimated he'd been forced to participate in at least 12 killings over those 4 years. The Morrison case broke him because it was the first time he knew the victim. "What happened to Samuel after Morrison's death?" Margaret asked softly. "He disappeared," Robert replied. "He kept traveling as a photographer, or at least that's what he let people believe. But my grandmother said he was hiding. The people who hired him decided he knew too much. She received letters from him for 2 years. Then nothing." James looked up from the records. "There's a report from 1914, an unidentified man found dead in the Chicago River. Same height, same age, same scar on the left hand that Sarah mentioned." "It could be him." Margaret sat back, her voice barely above a whisper. "He tried to save Morrison and paid with his own life. The photographs before them were no longer just artifacts. They were testimony, The final confession of a man trying to do the right thing in a world built to punish conscience. Robert, she asked quietly, why did your grandmother never tell anyone? Even after his death, she could have gone to the authorities. He hesitated. I think she was afraid. But also, she wanted to protect the Morrison family. Ellen Morrison and her children had suffered enough. She didn't want them to know that Thomas's death had been part of something larger, or that they'd been used as props in a murder staged for the camera. Margaret turned again to the Morrison photograph, faces full of life, unaware they were part of an image that would linger for a century, hiding the evidence of a crime no one had ever seen. James, she said finally, we need to contact the Illinois State Police. This isn't just history anymore. Sir, Detective Sarah Coleman of the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit arrived at the Chicago Historical Society the following Tuesday with a small team of forensic specialists and legal historians. Dr. Chen, she said, studying the Morrison photograph beneath specialized lighting. What you've found here could rewrite our understanding of early 20th century labor violence. We've identified at least 8 unsolved murders matching this pattern. The conference room had become an impromptu investigation center. Maps, timelines enlarged, photographs pinned to the walls. James compiled police records from 6 Illinois cities. Robert provided the letters and diaries. The forensic photographers confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The faint figures in the windows were indeed holding rifles. The angles are consistent with sniper attacks, Detective Coleman continued. Your grandfather, Mr. Whitman, may have created a photographic record of a coordinated assassination campaign. Robert examined a print from Rockford, Illinois, dated 1913. My grandmother wrote that Samuel became desperate. He knew he was complicit, but he also knew he was creating the only evidence that might someday expose them. Margaret worked beside the forensic team, enhancing the images with modern tools. We can now identify architectural details, even ownership records of the sniper building, she explained. James entered the room with a thick folder. His face was pale. I've been tracing the companies that fought unionization during this period, he said quietly. And Margaret. Every one of them connects back to the same group of investors. He didn't finish the sentence. The silence that followed said enough. 3 names began to surface again and again. Midwest, Manufacturing Great Lakes, Steel and Industrial Holdings Corporation. James spoke softly, tracing the patterns across the map pinned to the wall. These companies appear in every city where the murders occurred. Detective Coleman made careful notes, her brow furrowed. They had the money, the motive, and the reach to orchestrate systematic violence against union leaders. What we need, she said, is proof of direct connection. We may already have that, Margaret murmured, holding up a freshly digitized letter. This one's from Samuel Hayes, dated March 1913. She read aloud. I met today with the man who gives me my assignments. He made it clear that my work serves the interests of men who see worker organizing as a threat to American prosperity. He mentioned names: Johnston of Midwest Manufacturing, Cartwright of Great Lakes Steel. These men have decided certain problems require permanent solutions. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a long moment, no one spoke. If we can link those executives to the killings, Detective Coleman said finally, that's conspiracy to commit murder. There's no statute of limitations for that. But everyone involved is long gone, Robert said quietly. True, she replied, but their victims' families could still seek justice. And the truth would rewrite history. These men have been remembered as pillars of industry. Maybe it's time their ghosts were seen for what they were. Margaret's eyes moved to another photograph, one taken in Aurora, Illinois. Detective Coleman. "Look at this," she whispered. The image showed a family, the Pattersons, dated just 2 days before Harold Patterson, a foundry worker and labor organizer, was shot outside his home. James's fingers moved quickly over his keyboard. Harold Patterson, 34. Shot by an unknown sniper. March 18th, 1913. Police suspected labor violence but never identified the shooter. He turned the laptop toward them. And we have a photograph of his house, taken 2 days before his murder. There's a figure in the window across the street holding a rifle. Coleman leaned closer. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This is extraordinary. It's premeditation." Captured in silver halide, Robert flipped through his grandmother's diary once more. Sarah wrote that Samuel became obsessed with documenting every detail. He knew he might die, but he wanted the photographs to speak for him one day. He even hid messages in them. Messages, Margaret asked. "Yes," Robert said, spreading the prints across the table. "Look at how he composed them." Whenever he knew a killing was being planned, he positioned the intended victim slightly off-center or behind something, a post, a railing, a doorway. It was his way of warning future eyes. Margaret looked again at the Morrison family photo. Thomas Morrison, standing behind the porch, railing his children between him and the street. Samuel was trying to protect him, she whispered while recording the threat that surrounded them. Detective Coleman was photographing every piece of evidence. Dr. Chen, Dr. Martinez, Mr. Whitman. What you've uncovered may be the most significant cold case in Illinois history. This is evidence of a coordinated corporate assassination campaign that went unnoticed for over a century. James studied the timeline stretched across the display board. Detective. One more thing. The murder stopped abruptly in 1914, the same year Samuel Hayes vanished. His death didn't just silence him, it ended the operation. Why would they end something that was working? Margaret wondered. Robert opened his grandmother's diary one last time. Because Samuel had started keeping records, he said. Names, dates, payments, meeting places. He was building an insurance policy, one that could destroy them all if he ever talked. When they found out, they shut it all down. Detective Coleman closed her notebook. The sound echoed softly through the room. Then it's settled, she said. We've solved not just the Morrison case, but an entire chapter of hidden American violence. The only question left is how to honor the dead and tell their story truthfully. Word of their discovery spread quickly through genealogical circles, through quiet corners of historical societies, whispered from one curious mind to another. And within a week, Margaret began receiving calls, strangers' voices trembling on the line, each one claiming the same thing. They were descendants of the forgotten. The first to arrive was Patricia Morrison Walsh, a retired teacher from Springfield and the great-granddaughter of Ellen Morrison. She had grown up hearing fragments of a story that never quite made sense. Whispers about a man taken too soon and a promise that justice would one day come. My family has lived with questions about Thomas Morrison's death for 4 generations, she said softly, her eyes fixed on the 1912 photograph. My great-grandmother Ellen never remarried. She said she was waiting for justice, but it never came. Margaret had arranged the meeting at the Historical Society. The room felt still, as though the very walls were listening. Robert Whitman sat quietly beside Detective Coleman, their notebooks open, their expressions solemn. Mrs. Morrison Walsh. Detective Coleman asked gently, "What did your family know about the circumstances of Thomas's murder?" Patricia opened a worn leather photo album. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, carried the weight of one woman's lifelong search for truth. Ellen kept everything Patricia said. Letters, clippings, her own notes. She was sure Thomas was killed because of his work with the Foundry Union. But the police dismissed her. They called it a robbery gone wrong, though nothing was ever stolen. She turned to a page filled with newspaper clippings. The Springfield tragedy. One headline read, "Murder Still Unsolved." Ellen saved every article. Patricia continued. She also wrote about meetings with other workers' wives. They all suspected their husbands were being watched. But fear kept them quiet. Margaret studied the yellowed pages. The coverage focused only on the shooter's mystery, never the pattern of violence James and she had uncovered. "What happened to Ellen after Thomas's death?" Margaret asked softly. "She raised 4 children alone," Patricia said. "The Foundry offered her a small pension, which she never trusted. She said they were buying her silence." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the family portrait. "She used to tell us that someday the truth would come out, that Thomas would be remembered not as a victim, but as a man who stood for something." Robert reached across the table and gently took her hand. "Mrs. Morrison Walsh," he said, "my grandfather Samuel tried to save your great-grandfather. That's why my grandmother kept these photographs hidden for so long. She wanted his courage to be remembered." Detective Coleman's tone softened. "Patricia, your great-grandmother's records could be vital. Would you consider donating them to our investigation?" "Of course," Patricia said through tears. Ellen wanted the truth to find its way home. Just then, Margaret's phone rang. A man's voice, tentative, emotional, introduced himself as David Patterson, great-nephew of Harold Patterson, the Aurora Foundry worker, murdered in 1913. "Dr. Chen," he said, "I saw the news about your discovery. My family always believed Uncle Harold was killed for his union work. Do you have any proof?" Margaret put the call on speaker. "Mr. Patterson, we have a photograph taken 2 days before his death. It shows a man with a rifle aimed toward your great-uncle's house. We believe his murder was part of a coordinated campaign." There was silence for a moment. Then David's voice, trembling. "My grandfather spent his life begging police to reopen the case. No one listened. He died, believing the killers got away. And then the calls kept coming. Families from Peoria, from Rockford, from Decatur. Each voice carried decades of pain, carefully passed down through stories told in whispers. Each family had something: a photograph, a clipping, a letter, a diary entry, fragments of lives marked by the same pattern of loss. In every case, the victim had been a union organizer. In every case, the police had looked elsewhere, calling it robbery, jealousy, random violence. And in every case, the families had known better. One woman, Martha Reynolds, whose great-grandfather was killed in Peoria in 1914, brought a single folded letter. It arrived 3 days after his funeral, she said quietly, "No name, no signature. Just one sentence. Stop asking questions or your family will be next." James was cataloging every detail, cross-referencing their stories with police records and Samuel Hayes' letters. He looked up, his voice low but certain. "Margaret." He said these families weren't silent by choice. They were silenced by fear. And as Margaret looked around the room at the faded photographs, the trembling hands, the faces of people bound by a century-old wound, she understood something profound. History wasn't just written in ink and paper. Sometimes it was written in the silence between generations, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The first to arrive that morning was Patricia Morrison Walsh, the great-granddaughter of Ellen Morrison. A retired schoolteacher from Springfield, she had spent her entire life living under the shadow of one family mystery, the unsolved death of her great-grandfather Thomas Morrison. "My family," she said quietly, her voice trembling as she studied the faded photograph from 1912, "has lived with questions about Thomas's murder for 4 generations. My great-grandmother Ellen never remarried. She used to say she was waiting for justice, but justice never came." The meeting had been arranged by Dr. Margaret Chen, who invited Patricia to the Historical Society, along with Robert Whitman and Detective Coleman. The room itself seemed to carry the weight of everything long buried, the kind of silence that hums with unfinished stories. "Mrs. Morrison Walsh." Detective Coleman began softly. "What did your family know about the circumstances of Thomas's death?" Patricia opened a worn leather photo album she had carried all the way from home. Ellen kept detailed notes about everything that happened, she said. She believed Thomas's death was connected to his work with the Foundry Union, but the police dismissed her theory. They called it a robbery gone wrong. Though nothing was ever stolen, she turned a fragile page, revealing yellowed newspaper clippings from 1912. Ellen saved every article, Patricia continued. She even wrote down the things other workers' wives told her about strange threats, about men who watched them from alleys. There were whispers that union organizers were being targeted, but no one dared to say it aloud. Margaret leaned in to study the old clippings. The papers had focused on the mystery of the unknown shooter, yet not a single line mentioned the broader pattern of labor violence that Margaret and James had begun to uncover. "Patricia, Margaret asked quietly, what happened to the rest of your family after Thomas's death?" Ellen struggled, Patricia said. She had 4 children to raise alone. The Foundry gave her a small pension, something she never trusted. Why would they help the widow of a man they considered a troublemaker, unless, of course, they were trying to silence her guilt? Tears welled in her eyes as she looked again at Thomas's photograph. She used to tell us that someday the truth would come out, that Thomas would be remembered as a hero, not a victim. Robert Whitman reached across the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Walsh, my grandfather Samuel tried to save your great-grandfather that night. That's why my grandmother kept these photographs for over a century. She wanted his sacrifice to be seen, to be remembered." Detective Coleman's pen hovered above his notebook. "Patricia," he said, "your great-grandmother's documentation might be crucial, not just for history, but for evidence. Would you consider donating Ellen's materials to the investigation?" "Absolutely," Patricia said firmly. Ellen always said these belonged to the truth. Just then, Margaret's phone rang. The caller identified himself as David Patterson, great-nephew of Harold Patterson, another foundry worker murdered in 1913 under eerily similar circumstances. Dr. Chen David said, his voice unsteady. "I saw the news about your discovery. My family has always believed Uncle Harold was killed for his union work. Do you have any proof?" Margaret placed the phone on speaker. "Mr. Patterson," she said, "we have a photograph taken 2 days before your great-uncle's death. It shows a man with a rifle positioned to fire on him. We believe his murder was part of a coordinated campaign." David's voice trembled. "My grandfather spent his whole life begging the police to reopen the case. They never listened. He died still believing the killers had escaped justice. And then slowly, others came forward. Families who had also kept boxes of brittle letters and photographs tucked away in attics, each carrying their own fragments of a terrible truth. Margaret found herself meeting descendants of 6 different victims, each story echoing the same haunting refrain: men who had organized for fair wages and safer conditions, and who had vanished or been gunned down, dismissed by authorities as victims of robbery or personal disputes. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every murder tied back to the labor movement, and every investigation conveniently lost its way. One woman, Martha Reynolds, whose great-grandfather had been killed in Peoria in 1914, unfolded a letter her family had hidden for over a century. It arrived 3 days after the funeral, she said. It warned us to stop asking questions or more of us would die. James, sitting beside Margaret, was documenting each account, cross-referencing them with old police ledgers and the letters of Samuel Hayes, the photographer who had captured the original 1912 image. "Margaret," he murmured. "These families weren't just victims. They were silenced deliberately. The conspiracy, it turned out, hadn't ended with the killings. It had evolved into a quiet campaign, one of intimidation, forged reports, and missing evidence. Detective Coleman coordinated with cold case units across several cities, and soon the pattern became undeniable. Several of these families had received identical anonymous threats, sometimes even written in the same hand. Whoever orchestrated the murders had also spent decades making sure no one ever uncovered them. Patricia Morrison Walsh had by then become the quiet voice of all the descendants. "Detective," she said during one meeting, "our families have carried this burden for more than 100 years. We always knew they died for what they believed in. But now, we finally have proof." Margaret looked around the table at teachers, engineers, nurses, retirees, ordinary people bound together by extraordinary loss. "What's remarkable," she said softly, "is how your families never let the memory fade. They preserved everything, even when no one would listen." Robert nodded. "My grandmother used to say that secrets eventually find their way back to the light. She believed Thomas Morrison and the others deserved their stories told, no matter how long it took." As the meeting ended, Patricia lingered. She waited until everyone had gone before approaching Margaret. "Dr. Chen," she said, "there's one more thing. Something I've never shown anyone." From her purse, she withdrew a small tarnished locket. Ellen wore this every day after Thomas died. She said it contained the most important evidence of all. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny, grainy photograph, a close-up of Thomas Morrison's hand, from that 1912 family portrait. Under magnification, she saw it clearly. Thomas was holding a small slip of paper. Ellen told my grandmother that someone had slipped a note under their door the night before. Patricia said softly. Thomas insisted the photographer capture him holding it. She believed it was a warning. Margaret's pulse quickened. If the note could be enhanced, if they could read it, it might be the final key to the puzzle. Patricia, she whispered, this could be the breakthrough. Your great-grandmother wasn't just mourning. She was gathering evidence. That night, Margaret stayed alone in the archive lab. The only sound, the soft hum of the scanning machine. Frame by frame, she enhanced the locket photograph until finally the faint writing came into focus. It read, Morrison, your union work has made you enemies. Stop organizing or face the consequences. This is your only warning. A friend. The handwriting was clean and educated, not the scrawl of a worker, but someone accustomed to authority. When Detective Coleman arrived at dawn, Margaret showed him the image. He stared for a long moment. This changes everything, he said quietly. It proves he was targeted and that he knew it. James, ever the historian, had already begun studying handwriting archives from the Foundry's corporate offices. If we can match this handwriting, he said, we'll know exactly who wrote the warning. Robert leaned over the image, tracing the edge of Thomas's hand with his eyes. Now it makes sense, he said softly. My grandfather Samuel positioned the family carefully for that portrait. He must have seen the note and known it mattered. Margaret examined the photograph again, noticing what she'd missed before. Look at his posture, she murmured. He's not just posing. He's defying them. He's showing the message for history. Later that afternoon, Patricia called from Springfield, breathless. Dr. Chen, I found Ellen's diary, the one from 1912. Inside, Ellen had recorded every threat, every letter, every shadow that lingered too long outside their window. Her handwriting told a story of fear and quiet defiance. Thomas, she wrote, had thought of going to the police, but other Union men warned him. The police worked for the same men who wanted him dead. And in the silence that followed Patricia's voice on the phone, Margaret sat staring at the photograph, again at the defiant figure of Thomas Morrison, frozen forever between courage and fate. She whispered to herself, he knew. Then after a pause, long enough to echo in the darkened room, and Ellen made sure we would too. There had always been rumors, faint whispers passed through generations, that some police officers in those days had been paid by the foundry owners to turn a blind eye to union activity. Detective Coleman was methodical, her pen moving slowly across the page as she listened. If that's true, she murmured, it suggests corruption so deep that an honest investigation would have been impossible. The realization settled over the room like a cold wind. The conspiracy might not have ended at the factory gates. It may have reached straight into the police departments themselves. Meanwhile, Margaret sat at her desk late into the evening, studying the enhanced photograph of Thomas Morrison's warning note beside a stack of Samuel Hayes's letters to his wife. I think I understand Samuel now, she said quietly. He must have known he couldn't go to the police. He knew they were compromised. So instead, he created a photographic record, something that could survive even if every witness was silenced. Across the table, James was leafing through old business ledgers, his face pale beneath the lamplight. "Margaret," he said, "there's something you need to see. One of the companies we flagged, Industrial Holdings Corporation, owned property in Springfield right near the Morrison home. The same block where the sniper was positioned. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying precision. The murder of Thomas Morrison wasn't random, nor was it the isolated act of a fanatic. It had been part of a carefully organized campaign of terror, a corporate effort to break the back of the labor movement through fear." Robert opened his grandmother Sarah's diary to a page dated just after the murder. Her words trembled with sorrow. "Samuel came home that night in despair. He said he tried to save Thomas, but he had to watch him die. He said the note Thomas held wasn't meant to warn him. It was meant to make him afraid before they killed him." Margaret sat in silence as the horror of it sank in. "So it wasn't a warning," she whispered. "It was a form of torture, psychological terror, written on paper." Detective Coleman closed her notebook slowly, her voice steady but hard. "Then let's call it what it is. What we've uncovered here is domestic terrorism. American businessmen waging war on American workers. These people deserve to be remembered as the heroes they were." Days later, the Illinois Attorney General's office announced something that hadn't happened before: the creation of a special historical crimes task force to investigate the Morrison case and the related murders. Dr. Margaret Chen, who had started this journey as a quiet researcher, suddenly found herself at the center of a national reckoning. She worked closely with legal experts, trying to determine what justice could still mean after more than a century. Then, on a crisp morning at the Illinois State Capitol, Attorney General Patricia Stevens stood before the press. Behind her were Margaret Detective Coleman and several descendants of the victims, ordinary people carrying extraordinary history. Today, the Attorney General began, "We acknowledge a grave injustice that remained hidden for over 100 years. The evidence uncovered by Dr. Chen and her team proves that at least 8 Illinois workers were murdered between 1912 and 1914 as part of a corporate conspiracy to suppress labor organizing." The media response was immediate and thunderous. Headlines filled front pages across the country. "Century-old murder conspiracy exposed," "Corporate America's hidden history of violence." And there, printed everywhere, was that haunting image: the Morrison family photograph, the faint silhouette of a gunman in the window behind them, and Thomas's hand clutching the note that had sealed his fate. At the press conference, Patricia Morrison Walsh stepped up to the podium, representing all the families who had waited generations for this day. Her voice was calm, almost serene. Thomas Morrison and the others died fighting for basic rights, safe conditions, fair wages, and the right to organize. Their killers meant to silence them, but instead, their courage has echoed through 4 generations of our families. Margaret watched from the audience as Patricia lifted the enlarged photograph for everyone to see. "My great-great-grandmother Ellen Morrison preserved this image," she said. She believed that someday justice would find its way through. It took 112 years, but that day has finally come. The task force soon expanded its investigation, partnering with historians from universities across Illinois. One of them, Professor Michael Rodriguez, presented his findings to the press. What Dr. Chen discovered isn't an isolated case. It fits into a national pattern organized corporate violence against workers hidden behind a century of silence. The Morrison case gives us rare, undeniable documentation of how those conspiracies operated in the shadows. Robert Whitman had also made his own quiet contribution. He had donated his grandmother Sarah Hayes's entire collection. The letters, the diary, the photographs to the Illinois State Archives. He spoke softly during the ceremony. My grandmother carried this secret for 85 years. She once made me promise not to release her husband's story until everyone who could be hurt by it was gone. Now that promise is fulfilled, and Samuel Hayes can finally be remembered not as a bystander but as a man who tried to do what was right. Detective Coleman stepped forward with the final announcement. The Cold Case Unit had officially closed the Morrison case, and 7 others like it, marking them as solved homicides crimes committed by conspirators working under corporate direction. No one alive could face prosecution now, but the record had been corrected. The silence finally broken, and as Margaret looked once more at the old photograph, that single frozen moment of defiance, she realized that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes softly a century later in the form of remembrance. The descendants of the victims had gathered together, bound not by blood alone, but by the weight of memory. They called themselves a memorial committee, though it was clear that what they truly sought was peace. David Patterson, great-nephew of Harold Patterson, spoke softly at their first meeting. "We're working with the Illinois Labor History Society," he said, "to build a memorial garden in Springfield. One marker for every name we know. We want people to remember that the rights of American workers were not gifts they were paid for in blood. Word of their efforts spread quietly, like a ripple across still water." Margaret began receiving letters and calls from documentary filmmakers, publishers, museum curators, all drawn to the strange power of the story. The Morrison photograph, once an old and forgotten image, had become something far greater, a silent emblem of hidden history. Proof, Margaret told a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, that truth can survive even when the powerful try to bury it. James Martinez had gathered their findings into a sweeping report for the Journal of American Labor History. What's unique, he wrote, isn't just the evidence of conspiracy, it's that ordinary people guarded it for more than a century, never knowing if anyone would believe them. The Illinois General Assembly soon passed a resolution naming Thomas Morrison and his fellow victims martyrs for workers' rights. They declared September 15th Labor Heroes Memorial Day. At the signing ceremony, hundreds of descendants and activists filled the Grand Rotunda. Governor Jennifer Walsh signed her name to history as Margaret watched in quiet awe, surrounded by faces that carried generations of waiting. The photograph that once gathered dust in Robert Whitman's hands had become something luminous, a relic of justice delayed but never denied. After the ceremony, Patricia Morrison Walsh approached Margaret, holding a small sealed envelope. "Dr. Chen," she said softly, "Ellen Morrison left this. A message to be read only when the truth was finally known." Inside, in the trembling script of a woman long gone, Margaret read aloud, "To whoever finds this, Thomas died believing that American workers deserve dignity and justice. His death was not in vain if it helps others understand that the fight for fairness is never finished. Thank you for not letting them be forgotten." 6 months later, Margaret stood beneath warm lights in the newly opened Morrison Family Memorial Gallery at the Chicago Historical Society. At its heart hung the photograph, 1912, surrounded by the enhanced images revealing the shadow in the window and the warning note in Thomas's hand. Visitors came from across the country to see it. Interactive displays let them sift through the evidence. Nearby personal relics, letters, pocket watches, lockets offered tender glimpses into the lives that violence had tried to erase. Dr. Chen said, "Patricia, now a volunteer guide at the gallery, thank you for giving us closure we never thought we'd have." Each afternoon, she told school children about her great-great-grandfather, how Thomas Morrison had died a hero, just as Ellen always believed he was. Robert Whitman, meanwhile, had founded the Samuel and Sarah Hayes Historical Truth Foundation, urging families to protect their old letters and diaries. My grandparents' story proves, he said, that history sometimes hides in attics and hope chests waiting for the right moment to be seen. Detective Coleman's cold case unit had begun receiving dozens of new tips, people bringing forward dusty photographs, faded ledgers, stories whispered across generations. The Morrison case, she said, reminds us that it's never too late for truth to rise. Margaret was invited to present her findings at conferences across the country. At a symposium in Washington, she told the audience, "History hides in ordinary things. A photograph once thought trivial can hold the proof of extraordinary crimes." James Martinez and Margaret later co-authored a book, Hidden in Plain Sight: The Morrison Family Photograph and Corporate Violence in Early America. It became a staple in classrooms, ensuring that future generations would know the cost of justice. In Springfield, the memorial garden was finally complete. Bronze markers honored each of the 8 confirmed victims. At its center stood a reproduction of the Morrison photograph beneath an inscription, "In memory of Thomas Morrison and all who died fighting for justice. Their sacrifice lit the way for generations to come." Ellen Morrison's descendants had donated her entire archive to the Illinois Labor History Archives. Scholars from around the world came to study her handwriting. Her careful notes, a widow's devotion, turned into documentation of defiance. The records that Margaret and James had unearthed led to something even more surprising. Several corporations publicly acknowledged their historical role in anti-labor violence and created funds to support modern workers' rights. In her quiet office, Margaret often returned to the original Morrison photograph, now safely preserved behind glass. At first glance, she had seen only smiles. But now, she saw something deeper: love, mixed with resolve, quiet courage, shadowed by the knowledge of danger. They knew, she told her students, and still they stood for what was right. Thomas Morrison had died for the cause of workers' dignity. Ellen had lived her years guarding the truth, and their descendants had carried the belief that truth, though buried, would one day be heard. Their stories sparked a movement. Museums began re-examining old photos. Historians found new questions in forgotten corners. Some even discovered faint figures in the background, echoes of long-silenced crimes. Each time Margaret turned off her office light, she thought about how one photograph had changed so many lives. The Morrison family story had been hidden for over a century, but never truly lost. It had survived, preserved by love, by guilt, by the faith of those who valued truth more than safety. Now it was more than evidence. It was a reminder that even the smallest artifact can carry the weight of justice. And as the last visitor left the gallery, each night, the Morrison family remained frozen forever in that moment of unknowing courage. Their story told at last, their names remembered. Justice had come 112 years too late. But in the stillness of that truth, it had never felt more alive.